Somewhere inside the Trump administration's own trade office, someone had to sit down, pull the numbers, and write out that American alcohol sales into Canada have collapsed by 81%. Not a Canadian newspaper. Not a foreign economist trying to score political points. The White House itself, in its own official fact sheet, justifying new tariffs, accidentally handed Canada the single best piece of proof that its boycott campaign is actually working. $582 million in American alcohol sales just gone in about a year. And Washington wrote it down themselves. Here's what we're getting into. First, we'll look at the exact number buried in the White House's own fact sheet, and why the fact that Washington admitted it matters so much more than if a Canadian source had reported it. Then we'll get into how this boycott actually started, back when provinces started pulling American products off government shelves entirely. After that, we'll cover the broader retail data, because this isn't just alcohol. Canadian grocery chains are seeing a real, measurable shift away from American brands across the board. We'll look at what's replacing those American products on Canadian shelves, and why that shift looks increasingly permanent rather than temporary. And finally, we'll talk about why American producers, not Washington, are the ones actually absorbing the damage from all of this. Let's start with the number itself, because it deserves to be sat with for a second. In a fact sheet published this July, justifying its latest round of 50% tariffs, the White House stated that from March 2025 through February 2026, Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages decreased by about 81% or $582 million compared to the same period the year before. Read the context here carefully. This wasn't a boast from Ottawa. This was Washington's own trade office citing the collapse as a grievance, evidence of what it called Canadian discrimination against American exports, while writing a tariff justification. In trying to build a legal case for more tariffs, the Trump administration ended up publishing the clearest documented proof yet that Canada's consumer boycott and provincial liquor bans are doing exactly what they were designed to do. You could not ask for a more credible source confirming this if you tried, because the source has every incentive to downplay it and still couldn't make the number look good. So how did this actually start? Back in February 2025, the moment the first wave of tariffs and annexation talk out of Washington hit Canadian headlines, this wasn't some slow-building grassroots trend. It was immediate and official. Quebec ordered American products pulled from its government liquor store shelves entirely within days. Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and British Columbia all followed with their own versions of the same move. This wasn't a handful of angry individual shoppers boycotting quietly. This was provincial governments, the actual authorities controlling liquor distribution in most of Canada, making a coordinated decision to block American alcohol from reaching their own citizens at the source. British Columbia Premier David Eby made Canada's position unmistakably clear when reporters later asked whether provinces might eventually restock American products. He didn't hedge for a second, saying there is not a chance in hell American alcohol is going back on the shelf in British Columbia. And more than a year later, this hasn't faded the way boycotts usually do. According to Loblaw's own numbers, purchases of American goods across its stores still haven't recovered. Industry scanner data shows volumes of American-sourced grocery products falling by double digits compared to the year before, a sustained shift rather than a temporary dip. Data from retail analytics firm dunnhumby found that mass and chain retailers still carrying American products saw roughly a 3% drop in sales penetration year over year, while Canadian discount and mass retailers leaning into homegrown products gained that exact same 3% right back. The money didn't disappear from the Canadian economy. It simply moved from American brands to Canadian ones, dollar for dollar. Alcohol just happens to be the clearest, most measurable version of this pattern, because provincial liquor boards keep such precise sales data. American wine exports to Canada collapsed from $446.5 million down to just $103.7 million in a single year. Spirits fell from $324.6 million to $176 million. American beer sales into Canada dropped from $46.7 million all the way down to $16.7 million. Meanwhile, on the other side of that same ledger, Ontario's local wine industry saw sales jump by roughly 79% in the first year of the boycott alone. Every dollar that stopped flowing to a Napa Valley winery or a Kentucky distillery went somewhere, and increasingly, it went to a Canadian producer instead. Here's why this matters more than a typical trade statistic. Boycotts almost always fade once the news cycle moves on. But this one is showing signs of becoming permanent behavior rather than a temporary protest. Analysts studying Canadian consumer patterns have compared it to what happened when Canadians switched away from the National Postal Service during a labor strike out of pure necessity and simply never switched back once the strike ended, because the alternative simply worked well enough. If buying Canadian, walking past the bourbon aisle, reaching for a domestic wine instead of a California Cabernet, becomes less about protest and more about habit and identity, then American producers aren't looking at a rough year. They're looking at permanently lost shelf space that a friendlier press conference from Washington isn't going to win back. To be fair, some Canadian economists have raised a real concern worth mentioning honestly. Simply swapping American suppliers for smaller domestic producers could push grocery prices up in categories where Canadian companies don't yet have the same scale efficiencies. Their proposed fix isn't to slow the boycott down, though. It's to speed up removing interprovincial trade barriers inside Canada itself, so domestic producers can scale fast enough to fully replace American supply without passing higher costs onto Canadian shoppers. That's not a sign the boycott is failing. That's Canada actively working out how to make this shift stick without hurting its own consumers along the way. So who's actually paying for all of this? Not Ottawa. American wineries, distilleries, and breweries that spent years building shelf space and brand loyalty across Canada are the ones watching that investment evaporate, documented in their own government's paperwork. And here's the part that should really sting in Washington. This collapse happened specifically in a product category, alcohol, where American producers had virtually no way of shifting sales anywhere else the way Canadian aluminum producers pivoted toward Europe. A bottle of Kentucky bourbon that Canadians won't buy anymore doesn't have some equally lucrative alternative market waiting for it. That revenue is largely just gone. So that's the full picture, a number that was never supposed to help Canada's case, sitting inside the Trump administration's own official justification for more tariffs, proving in black and white that Canadians walking past American products on purpose has already cost American producers over $500 million in a single category alone. There's a broader lesson in here too, one worth remembering the next time a headline talks about how a boycott is just symbolic. Numbers like 81% don't come from symbolism. They come from millions of individual decisions repeated at checkout counters every single week for over a year straight. Governments can write tariff proclamations in a single afternoon, but rebuilding a distribution relationship, a brand's shelf space, and a customer's habit of reaching for a specific bottle takes far longer than any negotiation timeline Washington is currently working on. That's the quiet mismatch sitting underneath this entire trade war. Tariffs can be undone with a signature, but a boycott this deep, once it hardens into habit, doesn't reverse nearly as easily. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments. Do you think this boycott ever fades? Or is American alcohol permanently losing its place on Canadian shelves?